Hi everyone, and welcome to this Grattan Institute webinar. Today we are going to talk about Australia's permanent skilled migration program and how we might reset it as our borders reopen. I'm Danielle Wood, I'm CEO of the Grattan Institute, and I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the various lands from which we meet from around the country. And I think it is an important reminder in a seminar about migration that most of us are migrants to this country. Whether you're first generation or fifth, it is a privilege for all of us to share the land with people who are connected to one of the oldest continuous cultures on earth. Migration is a hugely important policy topic. It matters so much Australia's economy, Australia's society, Australia's culture. So it is surprising that it's a topic that doesn't get a huge amount of attention by researchers and policymakers. But what we know at Grattan is when policy areas are not subject to much public scrutiny, there is often low-hanging fruit in terms of making better policy. So we were so grateful for the support of the Susan McKinnon Foundation to allow us to undertake what I hope you will agree is a very comprehensive and clear-eyed look at the issue of permanent skilled migration in Australia, and in particular how Australia can get the most out of the enterprising and skilled migrants that join our population each year. The report does identify some low-hanging policy fruit, as well as some fruit perhaps higher up the policy tree. I'm also really pleased to announce that Grattan have established a migration program, and we have a team that will spend the next couple of years doing more deep research to shine light on other aspects of the migration system. And it turns out that it is a particularly opportune moment to look at these issues. With Australia's borders closed due to the pandemic, there is the time to rethink and reset parameters and make sure that the various aspects of the migration system are delivering on their objectives. We certainly hope that the people ultimately making these decisions will find this research compelling and will consider using this window to make changes in the national interest. So to talk about what those policy changes might be, I am joined by two of Australia's leading experts on the topic of migration. First, Gabrielle de Souza. Gabby is a senior economist at the Committee for Economic Development of Australia, where she predominantly conducts research on migration policy. She has worked at some of Australia's most well-known and respected public policy think tanks and economic research centres, and I'm very pleased to say that Grattan is on that list. Gabby has conducted research also on education, multidimensional disadvantage, and area-based measures of exclusion. She has a master's degree from Monash University and is an affiliate of the Monash University's Department of Business Statistics and Econometrics. Henry Sherrell is the Migration Policy Fellow at the Grattan Institute. Henry has researched Australian migration policy for over a decade, working for the Department of Immigration and Citizenship, for a federal MP, and for the Federal Parliamentary Library. He holds a Masters of Public Policy from the Crawford School at ANU. Welcome, Gabby and Henry. Delighted to have you both join us. We're going to spend kind of the next 20 minutes or so having a bit of a chat. I would encourage everyone in the audience to submit questions via the Q&A function as we go. The dirty secret of webinar moderation is that if you put your question in early, it is more likely to get asked. Otherwise, it gets lost at the end of the queue. So submit early and submit often. Gabby, I'm going to start with you. You obviously have a lot of history researching migration policy in Australia. As I said in my opening, my sense is that relative to its importance, migration outside the issue of asylum seekers, which we'll put to one side here, is really under-examined in the public debate, but also in research efforts. Interested in your observations about whether you agree with that, and if so, why do you think that might be the case?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I do think it is under-researched relative to just how important migration is to Australia's nation building and to Australia's history. Australia has one of the largest proportion of migrants in the world. So, largest proportion of its population is migrants, rather. So I think some of the reason has to do with the way research gets done, particularly in the departments. Obviously, when the department decides, what to do with its limited resources, we've seen in recent times, especially since the introduction of Border Force, that a lot of those resources have, been devoted to administering the program and perhaps also to policing the program. And, you wonder where those resources have been diverted from. And there's some evidence to suggest that some of that resources, was going towards research and immigration. We know that around 2013, like pre-2013, like you look at the department's website and it's fairly unrecognizable from what it is now. There was a lot of research going, it was a really active area. So I think, we have lost, or the department sadly has lost some of that muscle. It's possible that research, gets done, but it's probably not visible to us outside of the department. So, trying to make sure or trying to bring about a system whereby there's more public availability of that research. I think that would be something that would help with that.
That's really interesting. So when you sort of shift the character of a department like that, clearly the research component can get lost.
Yeah, and of course at the moment as well, we're seeing like government department resources being devoted to exemptions, and so obviously that's another element that's taking up a bit of time. But yes. Yeah,
indeed. Henry, I'm increasingly learning that migration is a very complicated space. I was wondering, for the sake of the audience that aren't experts in this area, can you give us a bit of an overview of the migration system and particularly where this issue of permanent skilled migration that we're going to be focusing on today sits? And also just can you give us insight about why you started there in terms of the first Grattan report? Why did you choose permanent skilled migration?
Yeah, thanks, Danny. I think Australia has this sort of hybrid system of immigration, and at the moment we have a lot of temporary visas, a lot of permanent visas, and often each visa has its own goal. But as a system, it's hard to piece together. But we do know there's some big trends which have been occurring, and you can sort of think since basically British colonisation in Australia right through to the 1990s, Australia really emphasised permanent settlement and migration. So people would move here. That was partly a result of our geography, but it was also a policy choice, especially the post-World War boom, where Australia wanted people to come and settle. And it's quite distinct from a lot of other high-income countries, particularly in Europe, but also increasingly in parts of Asia and other parts of the world where countries don't emphasise that permanency and that settlement. And so Australia is sort of one member of a relatively small group of countries where that has a long-standing tradition. But really, since the mid-90s, and if you sort of think about this, the Cold War's over, the globalization is sort of everyone's talking about it, and one of the big movements in the mid-90s for Australia, from both the tail end of the Keating government and the Howard government in particular, was the introduction of more temporary visa categories and also more emphasis on those visa categories. And so we've gone from a system that was predominantly based on permanent migration and settlement towards this system where we still have permanent visas and settlement options for many, hundreds of thousands of people each year, low hundreds of thousands of people. But also this sits alongside this quite complicated temporary visa system where people sort of, enter on a temporary visa. Almost everyone who comes to Australia enters on a temporary visa. And then, some people shift to a permanent visa. And so we wanted to start on permanent visas because we think they're neglected in the debate. There's a lot of sort of public discussion about various facets of temporary migration, but permanent migration determines like who stays in the country. And if you think about the long-term implications of permanent visas, it effectively shapes how fast our population is growing. If you take sort of fertility as fixed and mortality as fixed, immigration is the thing that changes our population. And if you're on a temporary visa, you can only stay here for a certain amount of time, or you have to transition to a permanent visa, or you leave Australia. So we didn't think there was much discussion about permanent visas, and we didn't think there was much discussion about who gets a permanent visa, the composition of permanent visas. And so we wanted to focus on that because a lot of people have an opinion about the size of Australia, big Australia, small Australia, how many visas, but you see a lot less research, particularly in the policy space, around, regardless of how many visas you have, like who should get a visa. And so that's what our report really focuses on, and that we've really tried to emphasize that composition element.
Fantastic, thank you. I just had not a question, but a comment come through on the Q&A from Therese Smith, picking up Gabby's point from earlier and saying the Centre of Population, which I think is run out of Treasury, might be taking up some of that lost research and analysis, and they're certainly doing some, I think, really interesting and important work. So I think that's a good point, Teresa. Gabby, I can't run a seminar on migration without touching on some of the kind of recent debates. It was so periodically comes up in public life, but spearheaded recently by the RBA governor, who was talking about the link between migration and wages. His comments were that migration can dilute the pressure for wage rises because businesses are able to tap into the global market. We had a number of senior economists come out in support of those comments. I'm interested in your view, what you think of those comments and what the economic literature tells us about the relationship between migration and wages.
Yeah, that was a really odd week, I have to say. So a lot of the evidence that we have on wages and migration comes from the US, and the US have been reasonably successful with each wave of migration that they've had. And in those studies that analyze migration and the impact on wages and employment, most of them have found no effect on either of those from high waves of migration. Using different statistical techniques, so using things from natural experiments to, econometric techniques. Over here in Australia as well, we've had a few papers on that. So the PCs, the Productivity Commission's Migrant Intake Report commissioned some research from the ANU, and that research also showed that there was no evidence of harm by way of wages or by way of employment on local workers or on incumbents. And then more recently, for our report on temporary migration, I looked at migrants who had arrived in Australia since 1996. And, I found that there were positive effects for participation of local workers and on their wages as well. So we've seen, we've had a few goes at this. And sadly, for whatever reason, we still see these comments come up. I actually think it's also worth mentioning, and Danny, I know you were actually hosting that one. So I think it's worth mentioning that when the governor was asked to clarify his comments, he did say that he was looking forward to migration returning, and that he, thought that it was really important that businesses have access to migrants because we know that it has really important implications for business dynamism and capital development in Australia as well. So it was a weird week. I think the evidence is out there on this for people who want to read about it. And I know that the governor said some things, but I'm hoping that he'll look at the literature of it all. And yeah.
Yeah, I think, I was moderating that webinar, as you said, and I think probably was a more nuanced discussion that kind of then got picked up in the media, and they obviously kind of look for the most explosive headline.
Yes, to do.
I think if I can just say one thing, in our report, we talk a little bit about wages and immigration in chapter 3, and Gabby's right. Those sort of headline studies show sort of no effect at the aggregate level. But one of, I think, the interesting things conceptually to think about, and a lot of studies, regardless of what country, show this, is that there are sort of distributional effects within a distribution of workers or wages. And I think a neat rule of thumb is to think that, like, the closer you are, the more similar you look to a new migrant, the more you'll be affected. The more different you are, the more you'll enjoy the benefits. And that goes for both employment and wages. And once everything comes out in the wash, it's sort of like there's no effect. But immigration sort of does have an effect in that it changes things, and it sort of shifts things around, and it might shift sort of industry shares and composition of workers in different areas. And like that process of change can often be good. It can bring economic benefits, it can bring rising wages, but at the same time, change is hard for people to deal with. And I think that's not to say that immigration is bad or good. It's just sort of to recognize that when you have change, and when people experience change, it's a hard thing to go through. And often I think it's relatively straightforward to sort of look at immigration and say, oh, look, that's caused this, and therefore that's a problem. And it's a lot more complicated than that, I think.
Yeah, look, I think that's fair. And I think probably economic policymakers have often been guilty of focusing on the aggregate and the size of the pie, and not putting enough, and so we should say we should do these things that increase the size of the pie, but we should also recognise that when some groups are left behind, we'd help them with those transitions. Henry, so that's the sort of migration wages picture. What other reasons might we be interested in migration from a policy perspective? What are the sort of other economic and social effects that we might look to?
Yeah, there's sort of a host of changes and effects. One thing that we try to do in our report is sort of work out like who are we making policy for, because that changes the question. So immigration has a pretty big effect for the immigrant. A lot of immigrants migrate because it's better for themselves, right? You can get a wage increase, you can go and see your family, you have social benefits, and it's pretty self-evident and it's very rational for people to migrate, and they've been doing it for thousands of years to make their lives better. One of the things I think that we have to grapple with for immigration policy is like, who are we making policy for? And if we're making it for the whole world, you would sort of be erring much more liberally on immigration, and you would have many more people coming to Australia, because Australia is a high income country where more people can get high wage jobs because of our productivity. But we sort of have the framework that we're making policy for Australians and for people who are already here. And so we tried to think about how immigration policy affects people who are already here, Australian citizens and permanent residents. And that sort of leads us down, there are sort of fiscal effects at the federal budget level. If you have younger, more skilled workers who are in high wage jobs, it sort of goes to reason that they're going to earn more higher wages, and they'll earn more, they'll generate more income tax, and that has spillover effects for the sort of Australian community at large. But there are sort of a host of other effects, and we can think. Gabby mentioned productivity and some of the US studies. I think the evidence is a bit more thin on productivity than it is on wages when it comes to immigration. But there are studies which show, there's a productivity effect, at least in America. I think we should be a little bit skeptical whether they apply in Australia, given we have a different economy and a different labour market. But then they're not. We don't think that they're negative effects at the worst. They sort of could be quite small, benign effects. Particularly if you think of knowledge transfers and spillovers in different industries. But it's sort of patchy and it's hard to do. Productivity is a hard thing to figure out. But we also talk sort of briefly in our report about housing and congestion and sort of environmental effects and natural resource effects. We don't go into detail on these measures because they're more about how many people come. So they're more about an aggregate number of people. If you think about the housing market, sort of one migrant and another migrant, they might have sort of slightly different choices, but they're broadly going to be the same. But everyone needs a roof, everyone needs a house to live in. So because we're thinking about the composition of visas, we sort of noted some of the studies and some of the effects, and what you see with housing, with work from the RBA actually, which sort of documents this quite well, is that there can be a rent effect, and migration can increase rents, and that those benefits accrue to people who already own houses. And then, obviously there are environmental questions as well, in terms of climate change and sort of biodiversity and things like this. But again, we sort of thought that they are questions of aggregates. They're not questions of composition. And so we hope in the future that there may be a way to tackle these questions, but we're still starting out on our migration journey. And as you mentioned, Danny, sort of social and cultural effects. Our report is about permanent skilled visas, so it's an economic policy goal. But at the same time, social and cultural factors are sort of very much a part of any immigration question, be it a temporary visa or a permanent visa or support for migrants. And in Australia, we see that about 85% of people think multiculturalism has been good for Australia. And since the end of the White Australia policy, Australia's immigration program has become sort of more reflective of the region in which we live in. But at the same time, 60% of people, when asked, will say, immigrants need to adopt values which are more like Australians. So there's this tension in society where, we see the benefits, but, a lot of people, a majority of people, 60% of people also think that sort of more work needs to be done in terms of how we're all going to live together. And I think that that's one thing which as policymakers, it's a good thing to keep in our minds at all times.
Yeah, thanks, Henry. I mean, I think, that figure of 85% support, I think it was that you said, is pretty remarkable. And I always find it interesting how much that sort of Australia being a multicultural place really kind of plays into part of our national identity now. And when you ask people what it is to be Australian, often that is a word that comes up. We're getting some really fantastic questions through, so I'll come back to these kind of general issues around migration in a moment when I get to the Q&A, but I just want to make sure that we have time to ventilate a bit of the sort of specifics of the report and the recommendations. As we've said, this is about permanent skilled migration, this particular report. There's 4 visa streams that make that up: the employer-sponsored, points-tested, business innovation and investment, and global talent visas. Henry, can you briefly tell us about each of those, and particularly why you're arguing for the abolition of the business innovation and investment visa? Certainly on its face, you'd think innovation and investment are good things. Why are you saying that we shouldn't continue with that program?
It's a good question, Danny. So just very quickly, I guess, on these different visa categories, permanent skilled visas make up the bulk of Australia's permanent visas. 2 of the sort of traditional ways of having skilled permanent visas are: one is via employer sponsorship. This is where an employer sponsors a migrant in a specific job. This is commonly known as sort of like a demand-driven approach because it relies on labour demand, which then sort of a visa appears because of labour demand. 90% of people who get this permanent visa are already in Australia and they're working. They're working on the temporary work visa, which is the old 457 visa, which is now called the TSS visa, which sort of is the most political visa we have in Australia. But this sort of employer sponsorship model is sort of, I think it's like a 2-step process. You come on a temporary visa, you move to a permanent visa, and you're on your way. In other contexts, this is called sort of try before you buy. So there's that visa has been increasing as a share, and it's been come to see as more important to skilled migration over the last 20 years. The points test is a human capital approach to skilled migration. Australia was an early adopter of points tests in the late 1970s, iterating on a concept first seen in Canada. And at its core, it's about adding people who are younger and sort of have skills, whether that be in education or work experience. And it's about targeting those people and letting them come to Australia. You don't need a job, so it's not connected to the labour market as such. It's more about boosting human capital in an aggregate sense, and sort of shifting the workforce in a younger direction, albeit sort of quite in a small way, because the workforce is quite large and our annual immigration flows are relatively small compared to that. I'll just touch on the global talent before we get to the business innovation. Global talent is a new visa. It was introduced in 2019, and it's really a visa which is a discretionary visa for the Home Affairs Department to sort of cut through bureaucratic red tape, if I can put it that way. It's targeted at the technology sector, and it is a visa where I think there are many problems to work out, but we'll talk about that in a second. The business, as you say, what's the matter with business innovation and investment? Innovation and investment are good things. This is Australia's version of buying a visa. This is, lots of countries run by a visa, by a citizenship program, and most countries do it in a very straightforward way, where you pay some money and then you get a visa or a citizenship. We in Australia I think that sort of provokes our sensitivities. Like do we really want to sell residency, sell citizenship? No, maybe not. So instead we do it in this very indirect manner. People in this program are required to buy a business under the innovation stream. And this is an attempt to attract people with sort of business experience and acumen. But these visas are extremely difficult to design and implement effectively. And what's happened is that there are these benchmarks in this program where people have to show that they meet a revenue target, and people have bought businesses to hit a revenue target. So people are buying hospitality businesses, they're buying retail businesses, they hold them for 4 years and they flip them at the end of it, and then they get a visa. And it's not about innovation, it's not about productivity, it's not about bringing new practices to Australia. So that's the innovation side of things. These people are older, they speak poor English, they're not very well educated, and the number of those visas has been going up. So we see that as a sort of a poor outcome. The investment side of things is a little bit better, but not really. It's about people buying investment, buying assets, equities, bonds, Some people have to buy some private equity components as well, but they're relatively small shares. And people have to hold these assets for 4 years again to get their visa, and then they can do what they will with them once they've got their visa. But it's not a very big ask if you have a lot of money to set aside $1.5 million or $5 million in a set of assets which are relatively safe, and then you offload them in 4 years' time. There's not much additional investment being generated because Australia has good access to capital markets in the global economy. We're sort of awash with capital at the moment. So these visas are not doing what they're meant to do. And they're also sort of allowing permanent visas, which are capped, to go to a group of people who are sort of older and less skilled and have lower wages than come through other visa channels like the skilled worker visas. So that's why we think that this visa sort of doesn't really have a place today. Its sort of purpose is, there's not a strong case for it.
Fantastic, thank you. And the other visa category that the report questions, or certainly questions the size of, is the global talent visa. As you said, Henry, a sort of a permanent visa designed to attract people with talent and skills in primarily technology-related sectors. You mentioned, cutting through the red tape of the visa processes. Again, that all sounds pretty good. Gabby, were you convinced by the arguments put forward in the report that we should scale back these visas?
Yeah, look, I think in principle, it's a good idea to try and attract high talented people, like high talent and highly skilled people to your country and into the program. But I do worry about the splintering of the migration system as well to accommodate these other high skilled migrants. I feel like we should be able to accommodate them within the remit of the points test system and within the programs that we already have. I mean, we know that part of the reason why that global talent scheme was initiated was, partly to try and cut the red tape and try and process these visas really quickly, but also, we know that the ANSCO codes haven't really kept up. So that's the skills classification occupation codes. And so we saw a few occupations kind of fall through the cracks as we move into a more digital economy. Occupation codes from 2013, just, some of the occupations that we have now weren't really a thing back in 2013. So I think it's trying to paper over some of those cracks, but I think there are better ways to do it. And one of those would be to try and review the ANSCO codes and to bring about a much more transparent system. Obviously, we know that there's a lot more confidence in a system the more transparent it is. And my concern also with the Global Talent Program is that it's pretty opaque in terms of who gets in, what's the criteria, how do we define success in that program. It's a lot, and it was scaled up really quickly as well. So it started off with 5,000, I think, and then got ramped up to about 15,000 in the last migration program planning levels. So, I think it could be a good idea, but I think we just really need to see the data about it, and we need to be a lot less opaque about how people are chosen.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think the Grattan report was saying, we should evaluate certainly before we increase to those types of numbers. A very quick question that's come through from Brian Halstead. He's just interested in how many skilled permanent migrants we're talking about here. So how many are coming in it when the borders are open normally, Henry?
Yeah, it's a good question. Just before COVID, the migration program, which is a colloquial term for how many permanent visas we had, that was 160,000 skilled and family visas, and skilled visas account for 2 out of every 3 visas. So it's a 2 out of 3 share for skills and a 1 out of 3 share for family. Now the border closure has sort of thrown this system, as it's understandable, into sort of a bit of chaos, and we're sort of trying to prioritize visas which can happen for people already in Australia. So that has meant family visas have become a bigger share at the moment. But in the last budget, there were 79,600 skilled permanent visas allocated to be granted. Now they won't grant all of those visas, so the number will end up being lower, and those visas are then sort of sub-allocated into these different programs. And traditionally, the points test and employer sponsorship have made up the lion's share of skilled permanent visas, but those visa categories have been declining in recent times. while the global talent and the business investment visas have been rising, albeit from a smaller base.
So the Grattan report, and correct me if I'm wrong, Henry, is recommending abolishing business innovation, scaling back global talent, but then allocating those additional places then to the employer sponsored and the skills test visas.
That's right.
Just one final question on the report before I move to the questions in the chat. Those two visa categories that we were talking about just there both rely on or draw on an occupational list. So the federal government sort of sets a list of occupations that it says we need the skills in. The report argues that occupational lists are inappropriate. Why do you say that, and what do you think we should do instead?
Yeah, this is, I think, the low-hanging fruit of our report is the business investment visas should be scrapped. This is slightly higher hanging fruit because the way Australia has done skilled migration has relied very heavily on occupation lists for a long period of time. The points tested visas and the employer sponsored visas, as Danny said, rely on occupation lists, and they're sort of like they're the defining feature of Australia's permanent skilled migration program. The current lists, which notionally the idea is to target skill shortages, but if you think about a permanent visa, someone's going to come to Australia for 20, 30, 40 years, and skill shortages, where they exist and if they exist for many occupations, tend to be much shorter timeframes than that. So we're using, I guess, a policy instrument here, which sort of gives someone permanent residency, and we're sort of targeting a problem which should have a short-term time frame. And so we don't think that that's a good match. So we don't think that permanent visas should target skill shortages. Instead, they should target high-wage jobs. So the people who receive permanent visas gain a high-wage job, and that then they generate sort of more benefits in the economy for everybody else, as opposed to lower wage jobs, which don't generate as many benefits to everyone else. So there's a couple of good examples here. You know, my colleague Will Mackey, who was amazing doing much of the analysis for this report, especially on the labour market side of things. He looked at the labour market and the skills lists and mapped them out together, and you see all of these inconsistencies. So you see that structural steel and welding workers is an occupation that is included on the list, but concreters are not. Now, these two occupations are not exactly the same. You know, they do different tasks, but their skill level is broadly the same and their wages are broadly the same. And so they look kind of the same to a labour economist looking at a spreadsheet. Yet one's on a list and one's not. And when you go and try to find out, like, why is this the case? It's actually quite hard to find out why this is the case. And this sort of situation plays out for accountants who are on the list, insurance surveyors and technical sales representatives off the list, human resource managers, median salary of $120,000 off the list. So, like, why is this happening? And I think there's a bit of a veneer to this, and it's that, you know, we're very good at picking and choosing what occupations are really needed in the labour market right now with a lot of detail and a lot of specificity. We question that approach. We think that we're actually not very good at doing that, and employers are sort of better placed to do that. And so you don't want to have a free market in this because you'll end up with a bit of chaos. So you need some rules, but how do you write the rules? And we don't think you should write the rules using occupations and skills lists. Instead, you should have a wage threshold. That wage threshold should be, you know, the median full-time salary, which is about $80,000, $85,000 or higher. And that allows employers above those wage thresholds to then sponsor skilled workers. We shouldn't really matter too much what they're doing. It doesn't really affect us too much. If they're a chef earning $110,000 or a concreter earning $140,000 out in the outback because no one else will go out and work in sort of the Pilbara. So we think this is a simpler system. We think this is an easier system for employers. And we also think it's a system that will have relatively large benefits. So if you just look at income tax receipts, if you were to sort of implement this system and you were to get rid of the business visas and you were to scale back the global talent and you instituted a wage threshold, we think that there's the potential to sort of generate billions of dollars in extra income tax revenue over the lifetime of 1 year's worth of visa holders. And that's like a big effect from a thing that I don't think many people think about, sort of who should get a permanent visa, but it turns out it's quite important into the future. So we think that those wages would work a lot better than using a skills list. But that's an argument, I think, which hasn't really been voiced before. And we've got a lot of work ahead of ourselves to convince people that this is a good idea, because the status quo is sort of very heavily supported by a lot of people who use it at the moment.
That's interesting, because when you say it, it sounds very compelling and much cleaner and simpler than the existing system. This leads me to a question asked by Susan Love that I might get you to jump in on, Gabby, which is kind of goes to the appetite for change for these things. Do you think there might be an avenue to get some of the paper's recommendations examined or implemented, or what do you think the barriers might be, Gabby?
Yeah, so I think there is a bit of an appetite for change. I think Henry's observation at the beginning, and yours, Danny, that we're in a really weird situation at the moment where we don't have migration. So I think there is a bit of an opportunity to look at the program and go, what works, what doesn't work. And the government has a joint standing committee on migration at the moment, which is looking into this question of how do you try and select migrants when you don't have occupation codes or skilled occupation lists to rely on, because I think that's the number one complaint that comes up in a lot of these migration reviews, is that the lists are archaic, they're really hard to deal with, it's hard, it's like square peg round hole kind of stuff. And so I think there is some appetite at the moment to try and shift some of that. I guess the big question is, what do we use instead? And I think the idea around the wage threshold is really good. It's something that we considered as well. So we recommended in our report having applying a matching model to migration and doing it as a bit of a trial, and using a wage threshold and letting employers and employees interact before the migrant actually arrives in Australia. So it's, kind of similar in some ways to what Henry and you guys are recommending. So I think there's an understanding that the skills forecasting and stuff has served us for a little bit reasonably well. There might be some issues that we're now starting to see come to the surface. But I think there's a deep understanding that we might need to go further in terms of how we change that system.
Henry, are you sensing much appetite for change?
No, I wish there could be. I don't think what you've said, Gabby, is wrong. I think that the border closures is an opportunity to think about this. But to be honest, I think migration policy is hard to change in normal circumstances. I think it iterates over time. There's lots of vested interest involved. It's hard to get a big public debate. The migration system in Australia transformed quite radically from like 1995 to 2015. And yet very few people are aware of sort of details and sort of how things work and how everything fits together. And that's perfectly fair enough. It doesn't affect a lot of people's lives in the immediate sense. But it becomes hard, I think, to build coalitions for change and sort of where that change comes from. And I think in the current environment, it's the border closures are an opportunity. But I also think that there will be a sort of a lot of pressure to go back to the status quo, because that's what people will feel comfortable with. And that's, that's fine. That's okay. But we think that this is a good opportunity for us to outline how we could do this differently and try and sort of show on the merits of the argument why these are good. And maybe there are roles for new actors like, state governments where they haven't traditionally played a strong role. Maybe they can see a role in the future where we might be able to bring some of this stuff together. But yeah, maybe I'm a bit too cynical, but I don't think we're going to see this big sort of rush of change in 2022, 2023. But I do think that the ideas in our report hopefully will sort of stand the test of time, and hopefully over time they can be, achievable in a policy sense over the longer term.
Just before we move off the occupation list issue, I'll put this one to you, Henry. Mary Clark asked, does the wage threshold proposal make sense in all cases, particularly when many professions require further learning and work experience, presumably prior to getting those higher paid roles?
Yeah, it's a good question. This will be a part of a skilled migration policy setting. We think it can be a bigger part, but you're not going to have 100% of skilled visas come in at an 80,000 or 90,000 wage threshold. It simply won't be the case. There are also good questions, which I think we need to work through as a country about, say, the care sector. There's going to be increasing demand in aged care, in disability care. There's more public money is being used to provide services, which is a good thing. But at the same time, these roles are often low paid compared to other roles, and you're going to have this demand for a labour demand to provide services. And under our proposals, you wouldn't be able to hire people working in aged care on these visas. Now, if some people might say, well, we're going to need to hire lots of migrants to work in aged care in 20 years' time because of all the demand. And that may be the case, but it also may be the case that we need to pay people more to attract them into these roles. And so there will be jobs where you will need people, where there will be below $80,000 or the median full-time earnings. But I just think we need to be careful, and we need to sort of do it with our eyes open when we make decisions about sort of what jobs are eligible for what programs and why are they eligible. Because the benefits for everyone of someone on a relatively high wage are sort of quite straightforward. But of course, you will have people who are on lower wage jobs who are doing essential work, which is also critical to lots and lots of people. But we need to make sure we understand why we might want new migrants doing those roles as well. Because we can look at something like horticulture and we can see a labour market which has been broken and sort of crushed by immigration. And there is exploitation everywhere you look, and it's a very bad outcome for everyone. It's bad for businesses who want to comply with the rules. It's bad for migrants who are exploited. It's bad for Australians who have to compete at sub-award levels. So there are sort of like there's a handful of danger signs, and we can look at them and we can say, we don't want to go down that path. So how do we go down a different path? And I think that's something that we can think more.
Thanks, Henry. Gabby, the most popular question so far is one by Rob Thomason, who's asking about the link between international education and the skilled migration program. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, hi Rob. So I think it's an interesting one. Obviously, our immigration system in the past has been incredibly intrinsically tied to the migration system, explicitly even. And obviously that's kind of changed over the years. We have some estimates around how many international students stay on after they graduate, and Treasury's estimates have that at about 16%. Yeah, that's right, 16%. So most of them, most international students end up going back to their home countries. But it is I think as Henry noted, as we grow into the system where people first come in on a temporary visa and then hop to possibly another temporary visa, and especially in the international education system, that might first be a student visa and then a post-study work rights visa, and then if they might stay on after that, it will be some form of permanent visa. So I think those pathways are starting to get a bit more convoluted, and they're also starting to get longer. So by the time you've finished a higher education degree, 4 years plus 2 years in post-study work rights, and then you might apply for a permanent visa after that, and maybe some sort of bridging in between. So we're starting to get to like that 7-year mark. So these pathways start to get a lot more difficult to try and figure out, and a lot more complicated. So there is probably, I'm still not sure what the correct number is around that. I think 16% is credible, but it is possible that there are actually more. And with the way we measure who stays and who leaves, and the difficulties inherent in that because of visa hopping, that's becoming a bit more difficult to disentangle.
Yeah, I think everything Gabby said there was very on the point, on the money. It's a really difficult combination of policy goals, because on the one hand you have higher education, which it sees itself as a research industry, sort of teaching the next generation of Australian kids, and then you can take full fee international students, and you can really supplement your budget. That's not the only reason we do it. There's cultural links, there's social links. They are strong as well, but clearly money is playing a really big role in the higher education sector. Work done by Andrew Norton when he was at the Grattan Institute, and as he's continued at ANU, sort of points out that international student fees are subsidising Australia's research capacity at the moment. And so if we want to keep researching, if we want to keep sort of competing in that knowledge economy and those types of things, we're relying on international students. And that's sort of a hard hole to dig yourself out of when people come to Australia because they might want to study. Many of them do. Many of them leave. As Gabby said, 84% end up going home. But some of them want to stay. And it's sort of hard to look at someone who's been here 7, 8, 9 years and say, nah, you've had what you've came here to do, and off you go, sort of thing. So it's a very complicated mix of generating money for higher education, for research, for export earnings, and then the policy goal of who should get a permanent visa. And that's something that we haven't tackled very well. There have been a lot of mistakes made at the intersection of these two visas, particularly under the Howe government, at the tail end of the Howe government, where they linked permanent residency to student visas. Now, there were good things to happen from that as well, but the system became overwhelmed in a matter of a handful of years. And that was a hard thing to work out for migration policy. And it might have been the right policy call, but we didn't think about it, and we didn't dwell on it, and we didn't have the hard conversations with the universities, with other sectors, to figure out how to do it best. And that's what is really disappointing. I think often in migration policy is we make sort of rash decisions without knowing what's going to happen, and then we have all these unintended consequences.
Yeah, I think we're all getting a taste of what an unwinding of some of those cross subsidies looks like right at the moment, and we can see the universities are very much struggling and going to be so, I suspect, for a number of years now. I want to put a question that's come through, and it also came through from a number of people that pre-submitted questions. Gabby, this one is from Alan Ellis. Kind of comes at the issue from the other way. Doesn't encouraging skilled migration reduce the incentive on government and business to invest in training and educating the Australian labour force?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I would say not in and of itself. We do have, if the government is a policy maker and they have choices about what to do with the gains that come from migration. And of course, we have the Skilling Australia Fund levy on some of the temporary skill visa subclasses that put money into a fund, which is then directed into the National Partnerships Agreement, which is meant to fund apprenticeships and traineeships and things like that. So there are deliberate policy choices that we can make if we believe that that's happening, to be able to alleviate some of those pressures and to be able to funnel those gains, I guess, and so that money comes from the employers that choose to hire temporary skilled workers. So those gains that come from hiring those skilled workers then go back into the system. So there are some choices that we make around that I think, and some policy recommendations that help to hopefully alleviate that.
Thank you. Georgie Moore from AAP has put a number of questions. I might start with the first one to you, Henry. What are the economic and social risks of allowing Australia's migration debate to be relegated mainly to asylum seekers and to recurring discussions about fruit pickers, etc., rather than focusing on the sort of issues we've been talking about today?
It's a good question. I'm happy to talk to any journalist after this event as well. I think that it's very clear that for a long time, Australia talked a lot about asylum from 1997, 1998 through till 2014, 2015. This is the same time, this is the same 20 years where immigration policy is being transformed by many governments, both Liberal and Labor. And on the one hand, you have this burgeoning public debate on asylum seekers and basically no public debate on visas, family, skilled, any others as well. And it's clear that there were effects. There was not enough bandwidth for the country and for policymakers to have these two conversations side by side. And so I think in the last 5 or 6 years, one of the consequences of there being fewer asylum seekers coming to Australia and Operation Sovereign Borders and sort of the consensus from the major parties on asylum policy is that now we're seeing more debate and more intensity of debate on different visa categories. And, that's not a good thing or a bad thing. I just think it's that there's limits. You can't talk about everything all the time, and that's completely fair enough. But now we are seeing a few more of those conversations. The Prime Minister used to be the immigration minister. He's, I think, very interested in immigration. He has overseen a population plan. I think he takes an active role in this space compared to, say, other prime ministers of the past. And I think that this government can do that because there's space to have some of those conversations. Now, I think those conversations can improve and we can do them better. But at the same time, they are happening in a way that they didn't for a relatively long period of time.
Thanks. I might put one of Georgie's other questions to you, Gabby, which sort of follows along quite neatly from that, I think. How would you propose shifting the broader discussion about migration in light of an increasingly populist debate that's likely to become more so as we head towards the federal election?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we've touched on this that much in this conversation, but I think we probably should, just the impact of closed borders and just how difficult that's going to be in terms of restarting immigration, and some of those articles that we saw that came out. I guess one of the things I'm really worried about is that we're going to get to a situation where we have artificially low unemployment, which is, it's good in one sense because more people are in jobs, but it's bad in another sense in that our economy isn't growing as much as it could be. And I think we're going to get into a really sticky situation where, part of the reluctance to open up borders will be to see some of those artificially low unemployment figures increase. So I think there's some really interesting discussions that are coming up at the moment, and that will come up in the future as well as we start to open up our borders. It's really difficult, right? Because all of this goes down to what makes for a good migrant, which is like an incredibly values-laden question, right? And it goes back, and Henry's kind of talked about this a little bit, but it's a really, really difficult question to answer. Sometimes people on really low wages, for example, would make an excellent migrant. They contribute to the community. They enrich our community. I come from a family of incredibly poor migrants that migrated to the Gulf countries in the oil boom then. And my dad didn't have very much by way of education or money, and they managed to become incredibly resourceful migrants. And it goes to the stories around migration. So I actually think that those stories around migration are Australia's stories, and they're Australian stories. And I feel like we need to get away sometimes, and I say this as an economist and slightly sheepishly, but I think sometimes we need to get away from some of the numbers on this and focus on the nation building element as well, as a complement to a lot of the monetary benefits that we can measure. So I'm sorry, that's not a very specific answer. That's not like a silver bullet. I'm sorry, but that's kind of how I approach this.
No, that's a great answer. Thanks, Gabby. I think that's a really great way to look at it. There's a few questions coming on about sort of specific distributional issues. So one is the impact of the regional SM. I don't know if you guys know what that means, on regional sustainability and skills atrophy. And there was another one from Felicity Costigan on the gender balance of skilled migrant applicants. Henry, do you want to jump in on either of those points?
Yep. I'm not very sure on regional SM, if that's state managed, perhaps. But on the gender point, yeah, it's a really good point. There are many gendered aspects at play here. The skills lists, which we have tended to use, have hewed to occupations that are more dominated by males than females. So care work is not included on the skills list. whereas trades occupations are heavily included on the skills list. So that sort of, who does these jobs, who participates in these types of fields, then has flow-on effects to who gets the visa, which is sponsored by the employer, who gets the spouse visa, and then over the longer term, if we look at family visas and partner visas in particular, partner visas are 70% female and 30% male, and that has a host of implications as well in terms of support services and sort of dependency issues, and in the very worst case examples, people who are in very vulnerable situations. And these are questions which, to be honest, do not get the sort of light of day in many public policy discussions. And I think there's a couple of ways to approach it. You can look at the labour market and start with that and say, well, why are more sort of females than males in these areas? Or you can look at the migration policy settings and sort of try to actively, sort of rebalance settings which are sort of more reflective of the population. Traditionally, we haven't bothered with either of those, and we sort of just let whatever happens. But they're very good questions, and I think that in light of sort of some of the public debates we've been having in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, we should be more active in these phenomena and think more about them, because there are ways to mitigate them, and they include things like English language support services for migrants who may not be eligible for them, to make sure that when people are in Australia, regardless of their circumstances, they are better able to mitigate some of the vulnerabilities in the system.
Thank you. Look, I'm conscious of time, and we just had so many fantastic questions come in, so thank you, everyone. I'm going to shoot one last question to each of you. I'm going to very briefly give you full power over migration policy in Australia. You're allowed to make one change. That could be to the policy-making process or to the policies themselves. What are you going to choose to change? I'll start with you, Gabby.
This is going to be a bit left of centre. It's not a specific policy change, because I'm the kind of person that if I was given a wish from a genie, I'd ask for like several other wishes to try and maximize the outcome. So what I would like to go back to what we started talking about, which was about research on immigration policy in Australia. And my wish would be that any research on immigration policy within the department becomes public. So that might be a bit radical in terms of, they might be a bit more selective about what research they do, for example. But I think, I think it gets to the heart of there needs to be a lot more openness in how we do evaluate these programs. And I think that was one of the really great things about the Grattan report and the recommendations from that about evaluation. That's really important if we want to, if we have this remit for this program to achieve the most good, we need to figure out what good is and how we get there. And I'm hoping that will mean that some of the recommendations and some of the research actually flows on to better policy making.
Brilliant. Thanks, Gabby. Henry.
I think one of my bugbears of working in this space for a little while now is that it's very insular, and that I get peeved off about that quite regularly. And I think it needs to be a much bigger, expansive public debate. Gabby talked about, migrant stories are Australian stories, but many people are not included in these discussions. These discussions occur in Canberra. They occur in rooms with white walls, a long way from some of the parts of Australia that are sort of look like modern Australia. And I think that we need a bit of political leadership talking about how the system works, why the system works, and why we're doing things the way we are, because that will generate a much more robust environment for thinking about immigration. And that's why I've come to Grattan. If we can write research reports that stimulate a bit of public discussion, I think that's a really good way to spend some time to think about it properly. And I hope that sort of policymakers, both elected and sort of also bureaucrats, can perhaps try in the next couple of years lean into this space where we can be more expansive about why we're deciding to do certain things and talk about it with people. You're not going to convince everyone, but at least you'll give them the time of day, and I think you'll get a bit of respect by wanting to have the conversation.
Fantastic. Well, I wish I could really genuinely grant you both those powers, because I think those sort of both institutional and broadening out of the discussion would be incredibly powerful. On that note, I want to say thank you to both of you. You've both, as expected, been fantastic, been knowledgeable, and I hope everyone feels like they're leaving this conversation with a bit more knowledge about our migration system and some of the potential changes than they came in with. I did want to say thank you again to Susan McKinnon Foundation for their support of this work. Grattan has just wrapped up our end of year financial giving campaign, and I also want to say thank you to everyone that supported Grattan. We really can only continue to deliver high quality policy advice because of the support of people like you. And really my mission as CEO is to make sure that Grattan will be here doing this type of work for the long haul. You don't have to wait to the end of financial year to give. You can make a donation now, and we'll put a link in the Q&A box, or look out for it in the follow-up email. In the meantime, please have a look at the research, or just have a policy chat, probably on Zoom, with your friends and families and colleagues about this important issue. Please take care of yourself during this challenging time, and thank you again for attending.